think we're in.
I think we're live.
I think we're live. A minute schedule.
We're just going to wait a minute or two for some of the people who've signed up just to join.
Not a problem.
Before we get started. I suppose we should do the British thing, really, Josh, and I should ask you how the weather is where you are right now.
The weather is pretty dull, I'm afraid. Pretty cold overnight. I'm not going to say I'm too far from you. I'm in our Reigate office at the moment. But yeah, we've got offices all around the country. So I've driven from Reigate, where the consultant office in Cumbria, and the weather was totally different. But yeah, Reigate is pretty dull. But apparently it's going to brighten up according to BBC this morning. If we can drop the BBC weatherman.
Hopefully. Okay. I think we shall begin, Josh, if you're happy.
Yeah, fine. Carry on.
Super. Okay. I would like to welcome you all to today's Shieldpay webinar, which is called Risk, Time Drain and Global Payments, Exploring Best Practices for Law Firms Managing Client Funds. My name is Ed Boal. I am Shieldpay's head of legal, so charged with responsibility for managing Shieldpay's day-to-day legal affairs and also supporting Shieldpay's revenue team in having discussions with prospective customers around our solutions, largely because before I joined Shieldpay, I was Director Compliance Officer for Legal Practice and also Money Laundering Reporting Officer at a boutique law firm, where I specialized in advising on corporate transactions and general technology-related work. I'm delighted to be joined today by Joshua Gillam, who's a consultant professional support lawyer at Taylor Rose MW. Taylor Rose MW is a top 60 UK law firm, one of the fastest growing in Europe, with over 1,700 professionals based in it, covering a wide variety of legal services. I think what is going to make today's webinar quite interesting is that I come at things both from a risk and compliance perspective, but also as a corporate transactional lawyer. And Joshua is coming at things both in terms of his experience as a conveyancer, as a property lawyer, and also as somebody who supervises other lawyers and supports consultants within the Taylor Rose MW team. So Joshua, thanks very much for joining me today.
No, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully I can, like you said, I'm more of a property-based experience, but hopefully we can have a constructive chat about how the world's changing as to AML, client money, etc. And yeah, be insightful for all attending.
That would be great. And in terms of the format for this webinar, for the most part, Josh, you and I are going to have a bit of a chat around some of the key takeaways from Shieldpay's recent research report, which is called Time is Money, Counting the Cost of Client Money Management for Law Firms. This was a report that surveyed legal professionals from across the UK's top 100 law firms, which of course would have included Taylor Rose MW. And the methodology for that report, carried out in June this year, was an online survey of 104 junior and senior law professionals. And that report has provided us, as a provider of payment services to the legal and professional services sector, with some really interesting insights, which we're going to explore today. So with that in mind, I guess let's just take a look at the current market state and some of the key takeaways from that report. The first one, which is absolutely no surprise to me, is that 75% of law firms have experienced a cyber attack in the last 12 months. Now that's really quite frightening, and it's certainly one of the things that if somebody was to ask me, what would keep me awake at night as a cop, it was that threat of a cyber attack occurring, and us really willing for us to be in a position to adequately address that risk and to mitigate the risk presented by that cyber attack. Larger law firms within the top 100 will, of course, have dedicated teams, response teams, and IT teams that are able to support that. I can only imagine that for smaller firms, that is going to be much more of a challenge. So this report was, of course, surveying legal professionals at the UK's top 100 firms, but they represent a small percentage of the overall number of law firms in the UK. And so I can only imagine that the risk for smaller firms without the resources to be able to adequately manage those risks and address them is probably quite severe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Of those 75% of law firms, 75% of the reports related to client accounts, which is even more terrifying from my perspective, because we know that client money is absolutely sacrosanct. When we are holding client assets, we have a duty to ensure that those assets are protected as best we can. The very idea that whether it's through a social engineering attack or a more sophisticated cyber attack, third-party actors would be able to get a hold of client money is really quite concerning. And one of the key ways in which cyber criminals do that is, of course, through social engineering and phishing attacks, with 75% of the top 100 law firms having experienced one of those in the past 12 months. There's also the question of increased regulation. So 36% of the top 100 firms have instituted precise rules for client transaction classification. This is something that I find really interesting in my discussions with legal and compliance professionals at other law firms, where they are willing to share what sort of policies they've put in place around the amounts of client money they're willing to transact through their client account, and the increasingly limited circumstances in which they're willing to do so. And a lot of that stems from the imminent threat of new fining powers from the SRA when it comes to compliance or a lack thereof with AML rules. Though I really don't think it's probably a driver at the moment, there is, of course, the concern that's been flagged by the head of the SRA around the increased contributions to the Solicitors' Compensation Fund as a result of the Axiomin's £64 million client account breach, which the rest of the profession are going to end up paying for, sadly. And when it comes to compliance, 30% of the firms that we surveyed believe that they're fully compliant and have implemented corrective actions in order to avoid enforcement action being taken against them. So increased regulation has always been a concern. And then the other thing that I find really interesting as a corporate transactional lawyer is this idea that handling client money also has an impact on transactions. There are already enough things in the context of an M&A deal that cause friction. Having to manage client funds in that process really shouldn't be one of those things. But 71% of all of the M&A deals undertaken by the firms that we surveyed are taking at least 70 days to complete. And the statistic isn't on this slide, but with an average of 2 to 3 weeks to complete due diligence on the parties to those transactions that have an average value of 50 to 100 million pounds. So it's causing quite an issue from a deal transaction management perspective. So that was just to sort of provide some high-level overview of some of the key findings of the report. And now, Josh, we're just going to dive into some of the key insights from the report, and it would be great to hear a bit about your sort of views and reflections on these things. So to kick us off, critical challenges. Probably not too much of a surprise in the context of M&A in particular. Managing international transactions is difficult. Go ahead, Josh.
Yeah, when our tagline is sort of smart and law, and we are always looking at innovations within the system that's out there in the market. to make things as safe and as smooth for clients. Holding, like you said, holding client money is sacrosanct. And when we're moving money around on behalf of clients, it's a very important element of what we do. Cross-border transactions are, like you said, much higher risk, and we always actively looking, and we've had discussions with third-party providers. Shieldpay is one of them, but there's aspects of systems that other providers can help us put in place to manage that transaction and make sure it's as secure as possible. And I think even down to the bare basics of obtaining the correct bank details for clients and making sure that you've got the right pathway to move information between client and law firm. We have a secure online portal, for example, with two-factor authentication, etc., etc. It's not, we can't be bouncing emails around with bank details, etc. It just doesn't happen anymore. That's very old school. But that's where we are heading, to make it as secure as possible, and it links on to your second point of confidentiality and data security. It's what clients are expecting now. It's not an added benefit of coming to a bigger law firm. Clients are expecting you to handle their data, and they're a lot more aware of how their data is being used, other than what it was years ago. They're much more aware. We deal with obviously bank details for source of funds, source of wealth, for clients when we're transacting properties for them. And it was only a couple of days ago a client comments on how their data is being used in a transaction and what sort of questions are being asked of them to provide the relevant information. That is a challenge for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I would echo that. I agree. I think clients are a lot more alive to the risks of their data and their information being shared with law firms and with other partners, and the confidentiality and security of that data is absolutely paramount.
And I think how clients are becoming more aware of it, it's much more in the public eye, where catastrophes of companies' monies going missing or being subject to fish tax and fraudsters. I think it's much more in the public eye. I think last week there was a BBC report of a company that lost 1.6 million, and it was purely because someone in their company had clicked the wrong link in the wrong email, and it allowed access to their bank accounts. All right, it wasn't a law firm, but it's not just us law firms that are being targeted. It's companies across every spectrum of the market.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's one of those things where I think even law firms that have the most robust data security and cyber threat prevention systems and processes in place probably still there's probably still somebody lying awake at night wondering if they will stand up in the face of a live threat.
I think it's I've a property background. It's the amount and frequency of money that's changing hands in the property world is huge, and the frequency and speed we have to make payments, especially in chain transactions. But we're able as a bigger firm to have a finance security team and an IT security team, like you said at the start of your message there, that there are maybe smaller firms that haven't got the economic basis to employ an IT security team or finance team in-house, and may have to go to an external provider to provide that.
Was there anything here, Josh, on this side that caught you by surprise?
Well, what caught me by surprise was actually some of the responses of what we've got there. We've got junior law professionals who are actually worried about the cost of facilitating that transaction. And then you've got your survey of senior law professionals specifically worried about international border transactions. Now, I think a junior lawyer wouldn't really have that commercial mindset to think about the cost to the firm facilitating that, and I might be doing the junior as a disservice.
Well,
But
yeah, I mean,
I thought that.
yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I pondered this one myself, and I was wondering where that really came from, and I wonder if it's more where the firms are passing on those costs to the clients. Do the junior law professionals feel in some way awkward when it comes to having discussions with their clients around passing those costs on?
Yeah, I think it's every junior, or especially in the property department, it's every junior lawyer's nightmare to have to ring a client and say, actually, I need further description on where these funds have come from, and it's going to take me another 3 or 4 days to establish where those funds have come from, and it's going to come at a cost to the client because time is taking you away from dealing with someone else's transaction. So it's that very it's the junior lawyer's responsibility at the coalface to give the client a call.
Yeah. I mean, for me, the surprising thing on this slide is that regulatory risk ranks at the bottom out of eight things that are considered to be the most challenging when it comes to handling client funds and facilitating payments. Now, I guess that might be because there is no inherent client risk in the process of facilitating payments on behalf of clients. But of course, we know that the SRA regularly takes action against law firms for things like, inadvertently using the client account as a banking facility, holding residual balances without any corresponding transactions. We've seen examples of individuals in law firms being fined £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 for failing to follow the firm's own AML compliance processes. So it surprises me that those completing this survey would not rank regulatory risk to be much further up the list.
Maybe there's a bit of naivety towards the potential risk to the individual member of staff. Like you said, I think in April this year, a solicitor got fined personally with £3,500 for not following the source of funds process of their own firm. But yeah, I think it might be that it might be that the junior lawyers aren't thinking that the SRA will personally hold them to account.
Yes, possibly. I mean, I think this brings us on to the next set of insights, which is around due diligence. And I'm interested to sort of get your perspective on this before I share my own. Do you think that legal professionals rather, are good at evaluating money laundering risk when it comes to advising on transactions?
You're going to get me in trouble when I respond to this one. I think you've got it's drummed into us as fee earners that source of funds is very important. I think when I was more junior, it was sort of you get your client's bank statements, you have a look through them, and there's no right or wrong answer. And I speak to junior lawyers across our firm, and I speak to them and I instill in them that it's not just source of funds, it's source of wealth, and that's a different take on the question. It's not just are the funds readily available in the account. It's how those funds accrued, where have they come from, and you trace them back at a significant time to make sure you're comfortable with how those monies have accrued. And I think the word comfortable is one I would use when I speak to fee earners, is at the end of your transaction when you completed and you look back at your file, are you comfortable with how you've conducted that aspect of the transaction? And I think that may be an issue where of course there's a right and wrong regulatory wise, but every transaction is different, every client's different, every financial situation is different. But I say that to owners, it's that level of happiness you've got.
There is a sense of unease, though, isn't there, when it comes to asking clients probing questions about source of funds and source of wealth. I know when when I was advising on quite a lot of early stage angel investment type rounds, going to the investors with a one-page questionnaire, asking them about the source of funds and source of wealth, was often met with brusqueness at best, and swearing at worst, as if to say, "How dare you call into question my credibility?"
Some people find it awkward.
Yeah, yeah, they do. I mean, it's not a British thing to ask.
No, it's very crass to talk about client money, and especially when you're on the phone to a client and you're picking bank statements, you're talking to them about where their money's come from. But like this, we have at Taylor Rose, we have a sums questionnaire which goes out at the very early stages of a transaction, so the client is fully aware of what we require in order to satisfy our AML checks. There's open banking now for source of funds that seems less evasive to a client. The client, we do the background work rather than directly asking the client for copy statements. That open banking option gives that just click a button and the client has provided some information as to what we need. And if there are any questions, it is awkward picking the phone up and asking for further information.
I mean, one of the things that's been really interesting for me to observe since joining Shieldpay, which is regulated by the FCA as a payment service provider, is just the different approach towards due diligence. So my sort of feeling is that in the legal profession, due diligence, in the same way as you have due diligence on a property transaction or an M&A transaction, it's very much perceived as a documentary process. You're asking a question, you're getting an answer back. You're asking for a document, you're getting a document back. As long as those things hang together, it must be fine, right? And then there's a certain element of confirmation basis that you really want it to be fine because you really want to do the transaction, because that transaction translates into billable work. And if you were to exercise the degree of caution that lawyers are characteristic of exercising, then arguably you would never work on any deal because you could always find something that just doesn't sit right. And the difference that I've observed at Shieldpay and how its financial crime operations team work is that there's this sort of extrasensory perception that they have, where they can spot things that I wouldn't necessarily have spotted. They can join the dots. They can access resources and do research that I wouldn't have been able to do. And therefore, they're more effective at identifying those risks than I think lawyers are. Now, I do know that larger law firms have dedicated teams to doing this, and I'm sure that they do it to the same rigorous standard. But thinking about the vast majority of law firms outside of the top 200 that are facing exactly the same risks and challenges, but without that resource, without that experience, and without that capability, there must be a huge degree of risk just sitting there.
Yeah, I think there is, and I think it also helps with even simply running it past a colleague. I think if you're sitting in an office, and luckily we have most of our people in the office are employed staff. We've got consultants who work remotely, but we have a setup where it's very easy to pick up the phone, even if you're working remotely, pick up a phone or do a Teams call with a colleague. There's a system we have in place that sometimes like I said, it's just better to get it a second set of eyes run across something. And if you've got the regulatory stuff ticked off, but you have sometimes it's a gut feeling that you think it's okay or think it's not okay, you get a colleague to run their eye over it, or you get them on the phone and saying, "Can I just have a second opinion?" I think that's fundamental to how it would work. I think that's probably even more paramount in smaller firms where, like we said, they might not have the economic basis to have rigorous systems internally in place. It might just be handing the file over to a colleague having a chat with them and getting their eye over it. But yeah, it's one of the most probably work intensive stages of a transaction, especially in property. We have it quite front heavy, and that is the major stumbling block to most transaction of establishing that. But yeah, it's becoming easier with systems in place, but there still is that time where you have to give your client a call and say, we need some more information to get it over the line. Ed, you've muted yourself, I think.
Sorry, yes, I have. Yes, I was getting some feedback, so I went on mute. The way I would put it to clients is, can you help me understand the following? Because it was a little less pointed, and I often find that worked. Just before we move on to the next key insight, just to acknowledge the other time drains here for lawyers, because they're not insignificant. Managing external stakeholders and client communications, for me, that would have been second to due diligence. The amount of non-billable, or rather non-recoverable time that was spent just communicating with people about when things were going to happen, when monies were going to move, all the while not being entirely confident that it was actually going to go that way. That was quite considerable. Administrative work, I mean, certainly in the firm that I trained at, and I'm sure that it's changed since, requests for, receipt of client monies, client to office transfers, all of those types of things was all done manually in triplicate chitties.
I remember those days.
Needed to be put in internal brown envelopes and sent to the accounts team. That was quite a burden. And yeah, managing banking partners, when I ever did have to open an escrow account, it was typically an escrow account on a joint instruction between two law firms with one of the major high street banks. And the time it took to get an escrow account open, let alone the complexity of having the funds released from that account, even when the form of joint release instruction was agreed, and then trying to close the account down after the transaction had ended. It really made you wonder if it was really worth it for the benefits that brought to the transaction. But yes, I'm in that respect, I'm pleased to say that Shieldpay is much more dynamic when it comes to providing those types of services to law firms. And there's a lot less faff involved.
Well, I remember there was one point that there was discussions, certainly in the property world, that there was a potential of completing on payment tokens rather than money moving through account. It was this token system where a token would pass from firm to firm. That was on the aim of speeding up transactions, but it seems to have, whether it has got into the wilderness, but I haven't seen it on any legal updates.
No, I haven't either. Looking at the next insight, which is around the real-time cost of due diligence processes, I mean, this is sort of more meat on the bones of what we've been discussing, really, with 40% of lawyers reporting that KYC collection verification takes 2 to 3 working days. I would say that, based on my experience, that's not too bad. I know that at my previous firm, we had spent some money investing in developing a platform where the KYC process was automated, and we were able to get that down to 1 working day in most cases. But nevertheless, if you're advising on a transaction that has multiple parties, multiple nationalities across multiple jurisdictions, it's going to be on the much longer end of the spectrum. And I think that's a real source of frustration for transactional lawyers, because if they've done their bit in getting the deal terms agreed and getting the parties aligned around some of those tricky legal issues that come up, for the whole process to be delayed because of KYC collection and verification is most frustrating. And yet, for the reasons we discussed before, it's pretty vital that we get those things right. What is your sort of reflection on the challenge of that?
Yeah, we're pretty lucky here. We've got a secure online portal, and we use a third-party ID checker, etc. And that actually can be same day. I've actually on a personal level, I've just instructed Taylor Rose to act for me on a sale and purchase, and um, uploading the relevant documents all through the portal, making a payment on account through the portal, T's and C's, etc. Getting all of that done actually came through the same day. But we have an in-house team that can go back to the client pretty quickly on updating the portal and saying, if you're having trouble, we can talk you through it. So we're pretty lucky here, where we've invested quite heavily in that. But it goes back to that topic we were talking about earlier. If you are a small high street, maybe 1 to 5 man band firm, that haven't got that, does it mean the client coming into the office with documents and having a chat with them, a cup of tea, and then you're doing your checks, etc. That can take much longer. And when you do throw into the work, if you've got an international client, and you have to obtain maybe notarized documents, translated documents, etc., it can take longer, and it's all right. We charge for obtaining ID and verifying ID, but actually probably the charge doesn't reflect the time and more importantly the risk involved. When I talk to consultants about time and risk, I'm much more erred on risk reward rather than your time, just because of risk outweighs your time massively. I talk about that heavily when I go around and speak to consultants and fee earners alike in our offices. I talk about risk reward, and sometimes taking that extra working day or a couple of days to sort it out properly is massively worth it.
Mm-hmm. And do you think that sort of risk reward equation is different at the top end of the top 100 than it might be for smaller firms?
No, I don't. Well, in comparison, I don't think it is. I think where we are as an industry, we're at the forefront of taking on the risk and looking at the reward. It doesn't outweigh it. I think that the risk is higher now. It's higher. I dread to say the words artificial intelligence, but even this morning I was watching BBC News and there was I think Susanna Reid was talking about it, that someone had impersonated her, and even her friends fell for the trick. And it was an artificial looking Susanna Reid. And I think every law firm is at risk of it because, like we said, the money they're handling and moving around.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, that sort of brings us on to the next thing here, which is around the risk associated with client account rules. This is in no way reflective of how I generally spend my weekends, by the way. But I did do a little bit of research over the weekend to get a sense of where client account rules came from and when that was triggered. And apparently, the big trigger in the UK was after the end of the Boer War, which in 1902, which resulted in a stock market collapse, where a lot of businesses, including solicitors' firms, went bankrupt. And at that time, client monies were commingled with the solicitor's own monies, with the result that clients lost their monies. And that was regarded as something that was completely unacceptable for any professional client to have to endure. But it wasn't until 1933 when what was the Law Society introduced a rule requiring law firms to keep client money separate from their own office account monies. And of course, we know that things have gotten a lot more complicated since then. When I started my law degree, we were handed a hard copy of the SRA's Code of Conduct. It was the very first SRA Code of Conduct. It said draft, not yet in force, on the front cover. I remember flicking through the account rules and just thinking, wow, why would any firm want to hold client money? But of course, at that time, I didn't know any better. And it wasn't until 2017 that the rules changed, allowing SRA regulated law firms and CLC regulated firms to effectively outsource the client account function through the use of third-party managed accounts. So the whole sort of journey has been a century in the making, really. We talk about cyber threats and all of the rest of it, but when you look at these specific client account rules here, um, and the reactions that law firms are taking to those rules, 12% of lawyers are encouraged to stop handling client money completely. It's understandable, and I look at the legal press every week, and there isn't a week that goes by where there hasn't been an individual fee earner or a law firm which hasn't been penalised for some failure in handling client money. And sometimes it's a terrible thing, like having a shortfall in the client account because the funds have been used for office expenses. That's a complete no-no. Sometimes it's an inadvertent breach where the lawyer thinks they're doing the right thing by their client. They've advised the client on a leasehold property transaction. Why wouldn't I use my client account to pay the rent deposit and to pay the rent every month? Of course, I'm going to do that for my client. That's a value add. But of course, you can't use a client account as a banking facility, and the SRA couldn't be tougher when it comes to enforcement around that.
Yeah.
In terms of your firm and internal client account rules, is that something that sits with a central team, or is that something that's devolved to each fee earner?
We have the ability as fee earners, certainly in the property department, to submit. We submit the payment requests to an in-house finance team, and we have. It doesn't leave the account until it's checked by two or three people, certainly, dependent on value. We also have high value transaction audits, so that document, once it's signed off, has to accompany the payment request. So we have, depending on the matter type, we have certain documents that have to accompany the payment request to the finance team. But yes, we have a finance security team and a finance processing team in-house, and that's purely, I think, just because of the amount of transactions we're making daily. And I think that personally, on a personal level, the option of having a third-party managed client account was alien to me. It wasn't widely known to me at all. But yeah, it's a system we have in place to keep that money as secure as possible.
Yes, for sure.
Yeah, and it's like I said, it's having that control of the payment as well.
I mean, I think we would say as a payment service provider that is the leading provider of third-party managed accounts to the legal services sector, that the uptake of TPMAs by the industry hasn't perhaps matched the SRA's expectations when they amended Rule 11 to permit third-party managed accounts to be used. And I've been thinking about what some of the reasons for that might be. And I think it is just this general industry-wide, I guess, characteristic that we have, that we like to be in control. We like to feel that we're in control. Yeah. And yes, there are cyber risks, and yes, there are internal client account rules risks. But the client money is sitting in a bank account that we can control. What could be better than that? But I think that what we're seeing in our discussions with law firms is that the tide maybe is beginning to turn, and particularly with professional indemnity insurance premiums skyrocketing, where maintaining and holding a client account may in some way contribute to those premiums being increased, but also just generally the cost of compliance increasing, that the tide may be turning, and law firms may be more open to the idea of using third-party managed accounts as an alternative to operating their own client account. I mean, for us as a business, it's about educating the market and helping them to understand, what exactly is a third-party managed account. I mean, one of the central things that I often have to explain is that it isn't a client account. So the immediate benefit of using a third-party managed account is that the SRA account rules don't apply, with the exception of Rule 11 about third-party managed accounts.
Yeah.
The money that we hold are not client monies in the hands of the law firm. They're still client assets. That we safeguard them as client assets, but they're not client monies for the purposes of the SRA account rules. And there's a few other fringe benefits as well. For example, you don't have to pay into the SRA compensation fund if you don't hold client money. And of course, that is of fairly limited scope for most law firms at the moment. I do wonder if the contributions to that fund are going to have to increase significantly to cover the Axiom Ints breach. Could that be a factor that plays into considerations, particularly by smaller law firms? Who knows? It's just conjecture as far as I'm concerned at the moment, but it is something interesting to think about.
Yeah, I think it's always an economy of scale whether the law firm can manage to keep that in house or have the option of having it third party, and I think it's also control is a good choice of word, and I think it's also it's change. It's a massive change, and it's a huge not just system change, but it's a mindset change of the law firm to say, what do you mean we can have a law firm and not have our own client account? That's probably a strange question to bounce around boardrooms of law firms, because it's probably never been asked before in the majority of firms that you're probably speaking to.
I mean, what would be interesting is if the SRA decided in the future that law firms simply shouldn't handle client money at all. Because if there's even a risk of a law firm having a shortfall in its client account for whatever reason that may be, surely the simplest solution to the problem is to deprive law firms of the ability to hold client money. But I think that really would be an extreme change of direction for our regulator to take, for the reasons that you just explained. You would be forcing an entire profession to make a fundamental change, which is a huge change in mindset.
Yeah, massive change. Process and mindset, definitely.
Absolutely. And now this is something that we'll both be able to speak to from different perspectives around how law firms are managing transactional payments. 74% of the legal professionals we surveyed said that they aren't using their client accounts to manage deal payments. Now that is a surprise to me, because I do know from some discussions with top 25 law firms that, for example, they won't receive more than 100 million into their client account for a particular transaction. So for 74% of lawyers to say that they're not using their client accounts to manage deal payments at all, that is interesting to me. And the question that kind of leads me to is, how are they managing their deal payments if they're not using their client account? I'm guessing that in Belarus, MW, the client account is still very much the primary means by which conveyancing transactions are closed. Is that right?
Yeah, or are they thinking that the way their firm sets, because there's a finance system in between, they aren't on the basis that it's the finance system doing the management, not not going into the account themselves and setting up the payment. Like I said, in conveyancing, Friday is our busiest day. Obviously, everyone wants to get into their house before the weekend. Fridays, we are as a firm handling a lot of payment requests in and out. Especially if you've got a chain, you'll move money very quickly. You're moving it from your sale ledger to a purchase ledger, and so on and so forth. So you've got not just receiving into your client account, you're moving from ledger to ledger and then back out again. And then you've got mortgage monies, etc. So we have a finance system that integrates. I don't know the IT level of it. I'm not that intelligent, but we have a finance system in place that manages those requests to finance, and I can only imagine it integrates with our banking partner. But that, like I said, that goes past my intelligence level. But that submission system we have, there are two or three checks in place before it even gets to requesting it from the bank to move the money. So we're very secure in that way. But yeah, client, that that 74% is a probably more of a shocking number than a surprising number for me, because probably my knowledge of third-party managed accounts is very limited. So in my mind, it jumps to what is the alternative? What are they doing to manage those payments?
Well, I mean, and I suppose in my experience as a corporate lawyer, I would say that pre-COVID, pretty much 100% of M&A and equity investment deals that I did involved monies going from client to solicitor client account and from solicitor client account to solicitor client account through the use of solicitors' undertakings. That was the standard model, and in fact, there wasn't. You would never have had an institutional investor doing it any other way, because they never wanted to be in a position where they let go of the monies before they had signed and dated share certificates, for example. It just made no sense. And then at some point during COVID, and I don't think that there's any particular trigger for it, but at some point during COVID, investors seemed comfortable wiring monies to the company after the deal documents have been signed, and companies felt comfortable waiting for the money to come on the basis that, well, if the investor's not paid for the shares, they're not legally entitled to them anyway. So maybe the whole client account to client account transfer that we used to rely on was nothing more than a risk-averse construct created by the lawyers. The picture was very much different when it came to private investors. And yet the level of due diligence that I would have had to undertake on receiving money from private investors was quite significant. So that's where I would have looked at something like a paying agent or an escrow provider as a solution to that problem. I've always been curious about why escrow isn't used more commonly in the conveyancing process, because of course in the States they talk about closing escrow, which means that the signed documents and the funds that are held with the third party have all been received, all the boxes have been ticked, and they effectively complete the purchase of the property. I've often wondered why we don't have a similar construct in the UK.
I think there's two things that sprung to mind on that one is mortgage monies. It's sometimes if you're not working with a high street lender, some lenders take the 5 working days to get money to us. So that sort of dictates timelines as to when we can complete with exchange, etc. My mind has totally gone blank on the second option I had in my head. But yeah, it was that mortgage monies that sets the timelines for if we exchange on the Mondays, unless we've ordered monies prior to exchange, then you can move pretty quickly after exchange. But then that's an option. The second one, I just come back to me, is sometimes we do hold money to order. If I try to do it, if I've got a few transactions on a Friday, if I do have monies on the Thursday, I get an undertaking from the other side to say, if I send it today, can you hold it to our order pending completion tomorrow? So that's
a sort of quasi-escrow.
Yeah, but that's only a day. It's not like in the States.
And it's clear that the purpose of holding those monies to order is in connection with the transaction that you're supporting. So there's no kind of concern around falling foul of the rules in that respect.
No.
Just conscious of time. On this slide here, it says it's 74% that aren't using client funds are relying on external management of client funds. I think that probably has a range of meanings that I'm not sure can be captured just by those 3 other options that are listed on the slide there. But in terms of attitudes towards external providers, which of course is of great interest to us, 30% of lawyers prefer using an escrow provider. Now, I don't really see that as an incredibly positive statistic. And I wonder, what does it mean to say that only 30% of lawyers using an escrow service provider? What benefits do the 70% feel they have in not using an escrow service provider and presumably keeping the matter in house? And again, I think it comes back to mindset, control, the risk reward equation that you alluded to earlier in the call.
And maybe I might be doing disservice again. Maybe ignorance to the option of it being there.
Yeah, and I mean this next point here about average deal values of the 50 million threshold. I mean, we provide escrow and paying agent deals on services on deals that are considerably smaller than 50 million. In some cases, it can be £250,000. But certainly, the larger volume of deals that we do would be knocking towards that bigger 50 million plus threshold, where I think the law firm, probably the partner, reclines in their chair and looks at it and says, do I really want my £500 or £600 an hour associate spending 5 hours a day undertaking due diligence on 400 payees? Probably not. Probably doesn't stack up, and therefore there's an opportunity cost, even a saving that can be made in outsourcing it and diverting that resource to more advisory work on other transactions. So I think that while payments seems like a very simple thing, well, it's pushing the button on money's going from A to B, it's considerably more involved in that. As we've discussed, there is significant risk, there is a time drain, and I think that law firms are beginning to recognize that there are alternatives that they can consider.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I think it's like anything. It's education of the option, and like I said personally before I started speaking to Shieldpay, the option even was I was ignorant to the option, just because of this fear of law. I was never in M&A or commercial stuff, so it was ignorance to the option.
So in terms of some closing remarks then from you, Josh, and based on everything that we've discussed, where do you see, and I'm not asking specifically about Taylor Rose MW here, by the way, but where do you see the profession generally going when it comes to handling client money over the next, say, decade?
I think it will become more to the forefront of individual fee earners' mindsets as to its importance. Not to say it's not drummed into them at the moment, but I think where it becomes more in the public eye, and it has been, it's becoming public press now of the issues, whereas it wasn't before. I think it will have a positive impact because it will force certainly the property legal market, where some people say it hasn't changed for a while, but actually the changes we have made in the property world have probably happened in the last 10 to 15 years. It's been a huge change, even with obligatory registration of property deeds. They're publicly available documents. That now it's not coming into an office and swapping your old title deeds over or doing personal completions with bankers' drafts. It's now we have electronic payments, we have electronic title deeds. But I think that it will become a forefront of an issue with law firms, and it will change the market, I think. And like I said a moment ago, it's education to the legal world that this is an option and you can have a law firm about your own client account. Because I think, like I said, in many boardrooms around the country for law firms, that question has never even been considered. How can we run a firm without managing our own client account? Because it's our client's money. And that will be I think that will be the question that will increase in frequency in the next 2 to 3 years.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I think that in addition to that, I mean, I think there needs to be more of a driver from the regulator around this as well. I can see them getting to a point where the rules become so restrictive and the penalties become so severe that law firms, that risk reward equation changes. There has actually been a question on the Q&A here where somebody has asked, how can law firms determine the risk reward balance? and what are some of the key factors to consider when choosing which option to take. I think that is one of them. It's the point at which the regulatory burden outweighs the benefit of
Yeah.
continuing to maintain that function. I think also there's a big element of social proof in the legal profession, and by that I mean law firms are more likely to take steps and do things if they see that other law firms are doing things.
Mm.
And at the moment, there perhaps isn't a critical mass of law firms in the top 100 or just in the industry generally that are taking that step to move their client account function out of the business and to a third-party provider. And therefore, there are law firms who don't want to be made an example of if they get that wrong.
That's
And
it. And I think even if they do take it on, do they want to break cover and say that we have done this?
yes,
A lot of law firms don't like discussing what they're doing internally.
yes,
So even if they do take it on, are they putting their hands up, especially in the say, we've done the whole third-party payment system?
yeah. No, very true. There is also one last question here, Josh, before we round things off. What are some examples of rules that law firms are putting in place to determine which transactions can be put through a client account? Do you have any sort of internal protocols around that at Taylor Rose?
Like I said, property-wise, we have systems in place when certain financial thresholds are met. We've certainly split our matter types up into more categories, so we can manage that internally and supervise them sufficiently. We have certain transaction types that go through certain teams in the firm, so we have those experts dealing with that transactions, and we've got an internal referral system. So if a firm does get something they're not comfortable with, it can be referred to a colleague. Finance-wise, like I said before, we have high-value transaction audits that need sign-off, and that those documents have to accompany the payment request. Otherwise, it's just rejected at the first hurdle. And we have a set list that of documents that accompany those payment requests. So we've bolstered our finance side. IT-wise, we have a secure online portal for clients with certain transactions going through those. We have a secure messaging system, direct to fee earner to client through the portal. We have a conveyancing platform that clients can use. And yeah, we have bolstered it. We've got on our emails, we've got a specific button if email looks slightly off. We have a report and delete button, which the firm I came from before, that would have been totally out. It would have been putting your hand up to your supervisor going, I think I've got a weird looking email. And our IT team we've got a help desk, we've got an internet security team. We split that. So we've got, hopefully we'd like to think we've got everything in place to barrier those issues.
I mean, in terms of my discussions with law firms around the rules that they've implemented, sometimes it's a very simple rule, like we're not going to transact more than £100 million through our client account. Sometimes it's things like where there are more than X number of payers or payees based outside the UK, or if there are any payees or payers based in high-risk third countries, we simply will not handle those monies. But I think also there is just a general sense of unease that law firms have when it comes to processing many millions of pounds via their client account. Yes, it's a facility that they have there. Yes, it's a facility that they've used for decades in transactions, but the threat landscape has changed considerably. And I think that law firms simply aren't comfortable with that to the extent that they used to be. So all that leaves me to say then, Josh, consultant professional support lawyer from Taylor Rose MWs, thank you very much for your time today. And,
thank you for having me.
And to thank everybody else who joined the webinar. I hope that you found that useful. If you have any burning questions that you didn't get the opportunity to ask, please feel free to email them to us, and we'll come back to you as quickly as we can. But thanks again, Josh. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.